If you go back 50 years, the power centres in Europe were London, Berlin, Paris, Madrid. Now, in 2008, those are still the power centres, but you also have a level above, i.e. Brussels, and you also have a level below, i.e. Edinburgh, Cardiff, Barcelona, Munich. The process of European integration very much supports the idea of devolving power down to the lowest possible level. And if you look at Scottish nationalism, the SNP has a very clever strategy of arguing for independence in Europe. The idea that Scotland would be better off if it had its own seat at the top table in Brussels. Scotland would be better off if, rather than having to negotiate via London with Brussels, that it could do directly. If you then bring in the European dimension, it is a very powerful instrument for the SNP to say, look, we're not separatists, we want to be at the heart of things. Devolution came about ultimately successfully because of a distinctive pattern of voting behaviour in Scotland from England. In the 1980s, when England was happily voting Conservative, Scotland was voting Labour. And by the 1987 general election, there really was, I think, a problem, a disconnect, whereby the Scottish office, the administrative branch of the government that ran Scotland, was being run by the very small number of Conservative MPs who actually had managed to get elected. And the vast majority of MPs in Scotland were Labour. There was, I think, growing discontent in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s that Scotland was wanting different priorities. That argument, that sentiment had tremendous power and tremendous prevalence, if you like, because of the history of public policy and social policy being formulated in a different way from the rest of the UK. The various institutions of Scotland that continued after the Act of Union with England, the distinctive legal system, the distinctive education system, the distinctive church, even the distinctive system of local government, because that distinctive political system continued after the Act of Union with England. The argument, if you fast forward to the end of the 20th century, that the Scottish electorate was wanting different policies from the policies that it was getting, had a tremendous resonance. It had a tremendous legitimacy. You didn't have to be a Scottish nationalist to understand or sympathise with that approach. I mean, one of the most convincing arguments for devolution, say for example you're a sceptic, say for example you don't think that there should be a Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, there is no question at all that one of the most persuasive arguments is that if Scotland has its own legal system, it should also have its own legislature. If Scots law is different from English law, and if Scottish lawyers work professionally in a distinctive way from English lawyers, it is not unreasonable to argue that there should also be a separate legislature, a separate parliament to then frame those laws differently. And of course, none of that really has anything to do with nationalism or political nationalism per se. The Parliament has certainly made an impact, and the great mantra that it was founded on was the concept of Scottish solutions for Scottish problems. The idea that the needs of Scotland were very different from, say, the southeast of England, and that you needed a parliament or an assembly or some sort of political institution on the ground, near the people, accessible, open, accountable, and responsive to people directly. I think if you look at the last 9 years or so, you do see that actually being put into action. Social policy elements like free care for the elderly, the scrapping of tuition fees up front, and even the pioneering of banning smoking in public places are all very distinctive planks of social policy making that are or were distinctively Scottish, and, if you like, Scottish decision makers, Scottish policy makers responding to the needs of Scotland in Scotland, and not, if you like, having to adapt London-centric laws or ideas to a Scottish context. Any constitutional reform is going to be a blunt tool to an extent. When you're dealing with issues about how a political system should operate, there are always downsides. And there were downsides with the situation before devolution. And I don't think anyone who argued for devolution and who argued for the creation of a Scottish Parliament argued that it would be perfect, or argued that it would necessarily achieve every single thing that they hoped it would. But I think there is a consensus that, generally speaking, things are better. That democracy has been renewed or refreshed, and that policy making has improved and has been made more responsive. The big question, or the bigger question, and that is, well, okay, that's all very well, but how does this potentially make independence from the rest of the UK more likely? Well, of course, no one knows, and no one can say whether that's the case or not. You can certainly look at voting behaviour trends for the main nationalist party, the SNP. The picture is one of peaks and troughs. Post-devolution, since 1999, the SNP vote has gone up and it's gone down, and it's on a high at the moment. The slightly odd thing about the devolution process, the slightly odd thing about the campaign for devolution in the 1990s, was that it was supported by both Unionists and Nationalists. It was supported by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats because they thought it would strengthen the Union. But it was also supported by the SNP because they thought it would weaken the Union. And the Conservatives stayed out of it and argued against it because they thought it would weaken the Union. You had the very odd sight the night of the referendum result, when Scottish people voted for a parliament, of both the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the SNP punching the air with joy. People watching that, I think, perhaps thought, well, if they're both happy, what is this new parliament going to be like? How can they both be happy? Because in a sense they both want diametrically opposite things. But in a sense, in that example, you get to the heart of the nuances of this, because deciding where you draw the line with nationalism politically is much more of an art than a science, and it's almost impossible. National identity, of course, is relevant, but it's not everything. You have economic questions. You could line up 10 Scottish politicians and ask them, how much autonomy do you think Scotland should have from the UK? And you will probably get 10 different answers. And even within parties, you'll get different answers. And in a way, the very interesting thing about analysing this is trying to gauge where the lines are drawn the whole time.